Welcome to the next class in the How to Launch a Profitable Podcast course. In this module, we're going to be looking at marketing your show and growing your brand. So firstly, let's look at competitions. Now, if you're trying to grow your podcast audience, competitions is a fantastic avenue to go down. And why is that? Well, simply put, everyone loves getting something for free. So let's say you're thinking about running competitions. Well, what kind of stuff might you want to give away? Well, in our last module, we touched on producing merchandise and working with sponsors. So it really is a bit of a no-brainer to tap up your sponsors for items that you could then pass on to your listeners, or even to use some of your own branded merchandise that you might be producing. Ultimately, giving away items, regardless of whether they're provided by yourself or by your sponsors, is a win-win situation for both your podcast and your listeners. Now, obviously, there are some listeners who are more influential than others. Now, in my experience, the best thing you can do from a marketing perspective is to get your freebies into the hands of your most influential listeners. Because the more influential your listener, the more visibility your podcast is going to get. And the other great thing about offering freebies and running competitions is that it allows you to grow your email list for little or no cost at all. And this is even more true if you're giving away items that have been provided to you. And one more point I should mention here is don't be afraid to reach out to any brand that you think might resonate with your audience. Contact them, tell them how many listeners your podcast have, and that you'd be interested in running a co-branded competition for your podcast's audience. As we've mentioned before, brands are always looking to connect with potential customers, and running competitions with podcasters is an easy way for them to do this. So, like I've said, don't be afraid to just go out there and identify brands you want to speak with and contact them directly. Next, let's discuss mailing lists. Now, as a brand, which is what your podcast really is, your most valuable asset is your mailing list. And as a rule of thumb, the larger your mailing list is, the more likelihood you have of generating significant revenue for your podcast. So whilst listeners are the lifeblood of your podcast, don't be afraid to get your listeners' email. Because ultimately, if you have their email, you're going to develop a stronger and longer lasting relationship with them. Now, even if you don't necessarily have anything to sell, it's incredibly important to get your listeners' details and add them to your mailing list. Focus on building your mailing list and you will build your business. The more people your mailing list contains, the more powerful it is and the more reach you're going to have. Now, obviously, you can use your mailing list just to keep your listeners informed about your next podcast, or you could use it to upsell them a subscription or your merchandise or any item you may wish to push to your audience. But ultimately, emails and email marketing lists are the best tool to keep you connected with your audience. Now, obviously, platforms like Facebook and Twitter are fantastic, but by building your audience on those platforms, you're building Facebook and Twitter's mailing lists. You're not building your mailing list. And as I said at the beginning of this slide, the larger your mailing list is, the more chance you have of driving significant revenue. So, how do you actually go about growing your mailing list? Well, as a rule of thumb, listeners won't give up their details that easily. They will expect something in return. So, offer incentives, even if it's just something simple like access to your weekly newsletter or a reminder for when your next show goes live. Now, there's lots of different tools out there that will allow you to simply create and manage your mailing list. In terms of email providers, one of the most popular is obviously MailChimp. And if you're looking to get started relatively quickly and easily, this is a fantastic option. It'll even provide you with forms that you can brand and then embed onto your website so you can capture people's emails. And the important thing to remember throughout your podcasts and in the descriptions is to add links to your website where you can capture your listeners' emails. I can't stress this enough. Now, let's say you do go with MailChimp. You can also look at using solutions like Opt-in-Box that will allow you to capture people's emails just as they're about to leave your website. But ultimately, one of your main priorities should be to capture your listeners' email address. So urge them to join your mailing list by regularly mentioning it in your podcasts. The more you mention your mailing list throughout your podcast, the higher chance you have of capturing your listeners' email address. Next, we're going to look at self-promotion and authority. Now, regardless of the niche you're targeting, a podcast is more than just a medium. It's a platform to get noticed. So let's take cereal as an example. A few years ago, this phenomenally popular podcast blew up online and has had millions of downloads. Now, although they don't actively sell anything on the podcast, it is supported with sponsorship and they finance the music that they use throughout the episodes by linking to them on their website. But one of the most interesting things is the opportunity it opened up for the creator. Originally a journalist and radio producer, the success of Serial has thrust its creator and host, Sarah Koenig, firmly into the spotlight, to the point where she's giving paid talks and lectures, having guest slots on different talk shows, and making appearances on TV shows like Late Night with Stephen Colbert. The point here is to use your podcast to promote yourself and develop your personal brand. So, when people think, oh, we need an expert to talk about this, you are the first person that springs to mind. So next, we're going to look at featured segments and cross-promotion. You should try and identify other podcasters who you think will resonate with your audience and work with them to cross-promote each other's podcasts. This, in turn, will drive up both of your audience numbers and ultimately, as we've said before, more listeners for your podcast means more revenue for you. So try and think of podcasters who you think your audience may relate to, because the likelihood is if your audience relates to their podcast, then their audience will relate to your podcast. Ultimately, this creates a win-win situation for you, the other podcaster, and both of your audiences. So we've looked at self-promotion and authority, and we've looked at identifying similar podcasters that you can use to cross-promote and grow your audiences. But one of the best ways of growing your audience and becoming an authority is to share your knowledge. So try and find out and understand what it is your audience wants to know about and create content around that. And the easiest way to do this is to ensure that you're consistently and regularly blogging alongside your podcast. The more content you create like this, the more people you will be able to bring into your website and ultimately introduce to your podcast. So it's important to package up your content in an easy to understand and presentable way. And ultimately, creating this sort of snackable and shareable content makes it easier for your audience to then share it with their followers. Now, obviously, potential listeners can discover and subscribe to your podcast if it's listed on a platform like iTunes. But ultimately, if you're targeting these potential listeners with certain search terms in your blog posts and drawing them into your website, then they are going to be more valuable to you in the long run. And don't be afraid to brag about your podcast success. When your listener figures go up, shout about it from the rooftops. Showing off your podcast performance in this way and how well it's doing will help build authority, and it will make sponsors take notice of your podcast. Not only that, potential listeners are going to think, hey, they've got thousands of listeners every week. It must be good. I'm going to tune in. So it's reassurance for potential listeners, but it's also making you look really good so you can attract those sponsorship deals that you really want to grow your business. And then lastly, we're going to look at repurposing content. So you spent time and energy crafting some amazing content. But often, people don't realize how easy it is to then repurpose this content for other platforms and mediums, which can then be used to draw in even more listeners. So let's take a typical podcast as an example. You've researched your topic, you've got statistics and some interesting facts. People don't realize how easy it is to take this content and then repackage it. So each show that you produce can actually then become a series of blog posts. They could be repurposed and turned into videos or even packaged up into an actual course. The idea is to take the content that you've already got and that you're working on and to repurpose it in different ways so you can connect with more people. Ultimately, every podcast you produce requires a lot of work and prep. So you may as well reuse that as much as you can to save yourself time and energy. So don't rely on people hitting the front page of iTunes and finding your podcast. Think how you can take each of your podcasts and turn it into a blog post so people are searching terms on the internet can find it, or turn it into a video, as I've said, because then people that are on YouTube, which has millions of people on it every day, can find your content and end up on your website and then hit subscribe to your podcast. So let's summarize what we've discussed. Firstly, use competitions to extend your brand's reach. Build your mailing list to connect with your audience and create a much stronger relationship with them. Use self-promotion and cross-promotion to grow your brand and position yourself as an authority in your chosen niche. Share your knowledge in snackable content. Brag about your podcast successes. And finally, make sure you don't let all your hard work go to waste and repurpose your content as much as you can for other mediums and formats.